Mark, this hour is yours. Coming up, we're really glad you can continue with us.
Well, thank you for coming and for continuing our conversation. Let me tell you a little bit about the book, for starters, because it might frame a little bit of why I wrote it, and that will relate to the theme of what we're going to consider. So, I think the timing of the writing of this book was significant because it happened just as I was at the beginning of being called to be the president of Fuller. So it was a period where I had been on the faculty for 4 years, and I, to my great surprise, was called to be president. This was not something that I was in any way angling for or in any sense anticipating or desiring. It really came, I think, quite literally because of a call. And in this case, that was definitely a surprise to me. So, as I was trying to gather my thoughts about what I believed was central to the task of theological education right now, my concern was not for that only, but tries to be for a much bigger picture. What is the crisis in the church? And I think there's a lot of different ways that I attempt to kind of get a picture of that at the beginning of the book. But among the things that I think are a crisis of the church, in part it has to do with what I refer to as the ecclesiastical industrial complex. By which I mean everything from that kitchen that I refer to with all of its little harsh, negative, controlling signs, to really just the fact that every year in America alone, billions and billions of dollars are spent on this orchestration of this thing that we call the life of the church, whatever it looks like. It cuts across all denominations, forms, governance styles, liturgical styles, and everything else. And it's easily becomes what I think of as thick church, but the thickness becomes not depth, but a crust around the life of the church, which actually can smother out and quarantine the actual life of faith itself. The life of faith itself, as it's portrayed in the New Testament, and really I would also argue in the Old, but certainly in the New Testament, the image of the life of faith that we get is that it's vibrant, it's dynamic, it's alive, it's visceral, it's tangible, it's, through the images of the New Testament, the Spirit can go wherever the Spirit wants to go, doing whatever the Spirit wants to do, and the goal is to try to be as responsive and sensitive to the movement of the Spirit as possible. But over time, as we all know, the last 2 millennia, what has grown up around that central set of live and living practices is, of course, the institutionalization of the church, which has its own benefits, absolutely. But at this moment, it feels to me it also has noteworthy problems, which is part of what is being exposed by the decline of mainline denominations, by the decline of church attendance, by the disillusionment of many people who look at church and think of it as being disconnected, that it's what it says and what it does are two different things. All those kinds of crises, which we all know are part of the world that we live in and the challenges that are before us. So the question then becomes, how do you recover that? So the heart of the spirit of the book is really to try to say, what is the crisis and the promise? The crisis is that I think a life of living faith, responding to the call of Jesus Christ to be followers of Jesus as the central operating software and hardware system of our life, that we are created and called primarily to be followers of Jesus, has been enshrouded, encrusted, I want to suggest, in a set of practices that involve things like the labeling of kitchen drawers in a church building, where it all gets down to those, officious and understandable but hugely problematic ordinary spaces that we all live in, where we're trying to just do the best that we can, and we organize ourselves as we think makes sense, and before we know it, we're into a context in which that thickness has kind of surrounded and potentially even smothered a life of living faith. And then we equate faith with whatever the church is doing, instead of actually being an operation of our collective hearts and minds who actively put our trust in God, who is a community of like and unlike people pursue what it means to be a follower of that God, right? That's the trajectory. So how do we peel that off? So my first concern in the book is to ask, can we acknowledge the crisis? Can we believe that that same God who spoke in Jesus Christ by the power of the Holy Spirit still speaks? Can we actually discover how it is that we could have a renewed sense of what that is? And then, how do we eventually come to the next question, which is if I'm called to be a follower of Jesus, what are the circumstances that I'm living in? What's the world that I'm a part of? Both the world that I've chosen and the world that simply surrounds me, whatever that might be. We'll come to that in a minute. And what does it mean in that world to then ask, Lord, what would you want me to do as a follower of yours? Where should I go? What should I see? Where do I respond? Where am I called to act and to serve, whatever it might be? That recovery of what I would really just call the basic vision that the New Testament gives of how a life of faith is to be lived has just gotten so encrusted with institutionalism that in a certain way, not unlike elements, vastly different, but parallel elements to the medieval church, which then underwent its own Reformation. And so the fact that we are at a point 500 years later of literally celebrating the Reformation at a point, I would argue, of needing our own Reformation is a really dramatic thing. Now, having said that, I want to just bring to your attention what you, I'm sure, already know, which is the depiction of the church that I just gave is largely a depiction of the European and North American church. It's not a depiction of the church in the Global South. The church in the Global South is in a dramatically different circumstance than the one that I've just described. They're in many, many, many places, not all places, and not even all places as reported, because sometimes people have really dramatically different images of what's going on in the global church. But in many places in the Global South, the church is absolutely a first-generation church, where it's just emerging as the first generation of people really coming to an understanding of what it means to follow Christ and to live out that faith in light of circumstances that are around them. And that reality is one that is then explosive, and you know, and I'm sure have heard reports, whether you're thinking about Africa or parts of South Asia, or whether you're thinking about China, or whether you're thinking about Latin America, you would certainly find explosive evidence of a church that is unfolding in its dynamism in a way that is just really quite remarkable. So for example, there's a couple connected to Fuller whose children are students at Fuller. They're the pastors, the co-pastors of the largest church in South America. It's a church of 200,000 members. It's in Bogota, Colombia. It's a Pentecostal church. They have an amazing network of congregations throughout Colombia. And they host an event in Bogota on the 30th of December every year, which has usually about 1 million people that come to this event. And it's a worship event. It's not it's not just a concert, let's say, it's a rally. It's actually a worship event focused on healing, renewal, and the presence and power of the Holy Spirit breaking in fresh ways in people's lives. And that would be an example, a dramatic example, but by no means a singular example of what's happening in various parts of the Global South, where you have a church that is just emerging in this amazing and sometimes uncontrollable way. It intersects with that global church in the South, intersects in many cases, particularly in Latin America and in Africa, with the presence of one of our worst exports, which is the prosperity gospel. So in Latin America and in Africa, there's a great tendency for Pentecostalism, which is not prosperity gospel in its own terms, to intersect with the prosperity gospel, which suggests and teaches that really the God of the Bible is a God who seeks our prosperity. The benchmarks of our faithfulness are reflected in entrusting a God of faithfulness who will provide abundant material blessings. And that could come in the form of physical health and restoration. It could come in the form of material blessings. You might know, for example, the recent sort of internet scourge about this prosperity gospel preacher who believes that God gave him a word that he should buy, I think it's an $84 or $64 million jet, which will allow him to fly all around the world in this ministry without having to make stops. That's not so unlike the message of the illustration I gave this morning, but it's dressed up differently. So his assumption is, I have the power of God, you have the power of God, God's giving you money, God will bless you if you bless me, because it's that sort of pipeline. You bless me, God will bless you. The more you give to my jet, the more you will reap the benefits of that. So the tragedy is that intersecting this fresh, wonderful movement of God on the side of global Pentecostalism is its intersection and vulnerability to an experientialism, which in a certain way then wants to materially experience what it means for God to bless, and that can then lead people into this kind of deceptive theology of prosperity, which really then ties them up in their own circumstances that are extremely painful and often very, very destructive and abusive. But the point of the Global South is to say there is so much happening, and the church is growing, institutions around the church are growing, the evidences of God's grace are taking deeper and deeper roots, and all of that is really an amazing thing. But in the Global North, you have, as we all know, the place where so much of European churchianity ended up becoming something which had the church, a diminishment of a sense of an experience of God, a diminishment of a sense of immediacy of God's availability and responsiveness to our own world, a tendency to defer towards structures, money, science, sort of rationality over and against, as it's posed over and against an experience of encountering God and knowing God personally. So it's in light of all of that, the whole of that global church needs a fresh reminder that it's our call to follow Jesus Christ, especially to follow Jesus Christ in the places where it means the deepest sense of reset. Not the Jesus who just simply blesses more of what I already want and desire, but that actually, as we were trying to explore a bit this morning, actually gives us a new heart and a new mind to be able to actually want the things that God wants and then to pursue those things. So this morning, I want us to think a little bit about what that call and vocation actually means and how it is that we actually find hope in the midst of the whirlwind. But before I go on, let me just pause and see if you want to make any comments or observations about what I've just shared about sort of a quick scope of yes?
I have a question about the local job. It seems that we had a videotape, a couple of maybe like, I don't know, 15 maybe years or 20 years ago, made after a revival or during a revival in Labberton, which changed the whole city.
Yes.
Am I correct then?
Yes, there's been some very dramatic moments in Columbia, and I want to say that it actually becomes an interesting sort of case study because, thanks very much. It becomes a really interesting case study. So you know that Columbia has been involved in a civil war for 25 or 30 years, right? And it looked, as recently as a year ago, that there was a chance that maybe they were going to lay down arms, the militant FARC people and other groups that were part of the protest and opposition to the government were laying down arms, and there was a peace agreement. But very interestingly, the people that were the most opposed to actually coming to peace were Christians in Columbia. So it was evangelicals, and it was Pentecostals, and it was Roman Catholics who opposed this. They wanted justice. They wanted the people who were the perpetrators to actually all have to go to jail, all have to do sentences of time, etc. Now, whatever you make of a very complicated situation, which I'm not trying to reduce as simply as that might suggest, it means then that actually it turns out that the evidences of the revival, which has this incredible surge of God's Spirit, I would say at the very least could argue for it has not been integrated into people's understanding of social reality and the implications of this. The same thing, of course, is spectacularly true in our nation, where we have a history of resurgent and renewed and revival faith all across the United States, and we have a deep breakdown on the ability to actually allow that faith to actually reform and renew our social vision. Instead, we take our sociology and then we apply our faith to it and want God to do what our sociology has taught us is the thing that we want. That's a different picture than Jesus says. He doesn't say, just do what you want and God will bless it. That's not really the picture. It's you need a new heart and mind. It's like Paul saying in the text in Ephesians this morning, remember you were dead and now you're alive, but now you're not alive just because you've had some sort of steroid of the Spirit given to you. You're alive because you're alive in Christ, who is then renewing your heart and mind. So it's a really complicated thing. This is the story of course, sadly, the story of Rwanda. So Rwanda was the most overtly Christian nation in Africa, and it's this context where the genocide occurs, right? That was perpetrated in part by Christians on Christians. It was really the most extraordinary story of a failure to actually allow our faith to truly deeply integrate. So that becomes another example of the same sort of dilemma. Other questions or comments? Yes?
I love your use of thickness and crust.
Mm-hmm.
That just is a vision.
I'm glad. What does that strike to you? Why we've actually developed a church which often does nothing more than validate those paradigms, and then it doesn't do the disruptive work that it's actually meant to do. So let me just ask, for starters, how many of you would, what words would you say are the primary words that encapsulate in your mind the meaning of the Christian faith? Or what should the Christian faith do if it's operationally at work among you? What are the words that you would use to describe it? How would you know it's happening because of what? What's happening?
Kindness.
Kindness, okay.
Love.
Sorry?
Love.
Love.
Service.
Transformation.
Service.
Compassion, sorry?
Service to the community.
Service to the community.
Just not expecting people to come in here, but us going out.
Right.
In
So,
Jesus'
so
name.
a reversal of the flow.
Yeah.
Mission.
The love would be expressing,
Yes.
not just the word love,
Right.
but love that expresses.
Right.
Compassion.
Compassion.
Transforming.
Transforming.
Sacrifice.
Sacrifice.
Grace.
Grace, yeah. It's very interesting, you know how you can do a word, I've forgotten what you call them, those word paradigms, you know, certain words that you can follow and track which words are prominent. I've always thought it would be amazing if it was possible for a church to have such a paradigm done, where all of its stock words could somehow be shown up electronically so that we would see what it is that really actually matters. But if you imagine this congregation or the church in America, and if you think especially about the white church in America, the words that show up to describe what it means to be a Christian are really quite different than the words that show up in other ethnic church contexts in the United States. And it's partly because it's simply an expression of the fact that we live in our own social location, right? We don't apologize for that. I can't ever be anything other than a tall, white, educated male. I could try to erase that. I could try to, become shorter. I could try to change my skin color. I could try to learn other cultures in a different way. And if I did it in a way that was trying to actually become that, I would be not myself, and I would be falsely something else, right? So what I can say is I'm never anything less than a tall, white, educated male. That's my social identity, my background, the world that I live in. But that's a minimum. And in the kingdom of God, what's I think meant to happen is that becomes a set that is my starting point. But the kingdom of God actually is meant to then grow us into being much more than our social location, so that our ability to see, our ability to love, our ability to serve, to express the wonderful examples that you gave of different kinds of words of compassion and service and mission and sacrifice. All those are words that actually capture this sense of a life being transformed and enlarged. Enlarged in the sense of having a greater capacity to love, a deeper and wider ability to be able to see. But is that the kind of gospel that we're actually pursuing? Are we allowing our faith to be the kind of faith that instigates renewal in heart and mind? So where is there hope in the middle of the whirlwind of the world? I'd say it's in the places where we find God meeting us in our smallness, in the smallness of heart and the smallness of mind. So, but the tragedy and the thing that ends up becoming such a painful moment of self-reflection in the American church these days, especially in not just mainstream Protestantism, but also in evangelical Protestantism, is that there is a tendency, though study after study is done, about who are the people that hold this particular kind of compassion. The white, American, Protestant, sometimes evangelical church is one of the least evidenced bodies of people who actually love and care. So when the question is asked, who's prepared to receive immigrants in the United States? Footnote, I think the immigration debate is a complicated debate, and there's a legitimacy of boundaries, and how you work that out is its own kind of complicated legal issue. But now back to the main text. But in the midst of saying that, when they ask who is prepared to receive immigrants in the United States, on the whole, the majority of something like 75% of Americans are prepared to say yes. But when they ask that of white Christians, 68% say no. Now, what is that? How can it be that the distinctly Christian part of the population, the part that identifies as followers of Jesus, ends up showing so little traction in these places of some of the most profound human need. What's happening? Why do we think we do this? My theory, in part, is a theory that I'm building around fear. So fear is the fundamental character. And why is it that the American white church would be fearful? Just as you think about that issue, if you take my presupposition, you may or may not agree, but if you were to take it for a minute, just for the sake of the conversation, and say, okay, so why would the white church in America be fearful? What are some of the reasons why we'd be fearful?
Dilutes our opportunity.
Okay. Okay, dilutes opportunity. What else? Sorry?
Resistance to change.
But why, would you say?
We like it the way we like it.
And we like it our way. Quote, our way. Right.
Loss of privilege.
Privilege, loss of privilege. Absolutely.
Loss of
They're
power.
Loss of power.
They're the other.
They're the other.
We don't know who they are, or what they might do to us.
Right, what they might do. So there's a danger quality to this. What else?
Maybe the prosperity gospel says, I got mine, I don't want you to take any of it.
Thank you very much. The prosperity gospel does exactly say that. I've got mine and I don't want anyone to touch it. What else? You've given quite a stock. I mean, if we took all of those words and all of those assumptions and allowed ourselves to dissect them, I think we would get to something that's pretty close to the bone of the way that our sociology actually nurtures us, right? Especially if we are people who are white and privileged people, economically, educationally, culturally, and otherwise. There is a sense that something that might come from outside, the other, different, feels automatically threatening. When studies are done about the percentage of white Americans that have close relationships with people who are not themselves Caucasian, white. What is the percentage? What do you suppose the percentage is of people? Very, very low. It's between 15 and 20% of white Americans have any close relationship with someone who is not white. Now that is just a tiny, tiny percentage, right? And what it means is that on the most ordinary grounds, just regardless of anything to do with prejudice or racism or anything else, it just means that there's just very little contact, very little substantial contact. Very little sense that somebody else's life gets to actually deeply inform and reform my own life, right? That's an amazing thing. There are people, and I often think this is true in the Bay Area, I think it's also true differently in LA than it is in the Bay Area. But there's something that I sometimes call proximate diversity, where we have proximity to diversity, but we don't actually have any real diversity. It's not a genuine diversity of knowledge and understanding and compassion and mercy. It's just that I can stand in a line at a given place and realize there's a lot of diversity around me. I can enter certain spaces and go, oh wow, I must be in San Francisco. So yesterday, because San Francisco frankly has so much higher Asian population than you find in most parts of Los Angeles, where you have a much higher Latino population, I was really struck yesterday when I was in San Francisco by how Asian things were all around me. I love that part of being in the Bay Area, and Alameda County, at least at one stage about 5 or 6 years ago, was thought to be the most Asian county in all of California. Now, I could still have the highest concentration of Asian people around me in the Bay Area, and if I don't actually know Asian people, if they're not a thing, they're not a monolith, they're always individuals, they have their own subsets of subcultures and realities, their own narrative and experiences. If I don't actually know that, and if that isn't actually in me in some sort of way, then it's just proximate. There's nothing really, it's almost like we're decorating each other's lives with color rather than that we're actually being transformed by people who are not like us. So I would say, when I think about today, and this question of where is there hope in the whirlwind, I think there's hope in the whirlwind when we actually are growing in our own personal, cross-racial, cross-cultural relationships. So I just want to challenge and encourage you, if you are a person that has such friendships, to keep moving into them, to not let them reach a point of stasis where you feel like you've only gone so far. Take further risks, invest more time, listen more, don't talk, listen more, Let people tell you their stories. Give us a sense of standing inside the spaces that they actually live in. This came out to me in an interesting way in the last year when there was a set of events that were acknowledging the 50 years of internment camps for Japanese Americans. There are a significant number of Japanese at Fuller, and I've had many close Japanese friends, and I've heard the stories of their families. But because it was the anniversary of this, it created an opportunity for more storytelling. And so one of the things that we did is we took a group of Fuller students to Manzanar, which was one of the places where there was an internment camp. And we invited, it was just an open invitation, anyone that was on campus that could want to come could come on this day trip on a bus that we were taking. Well, because of the nature of it and the fact that we were dedicating a day to going and making this trip, of course we set up the whole day around storytelling, right? How do you hear and understand the family stories that are there? Well, on this trip, there were several people who had, they said, never spoken about the family experiences that they had had in Manzanar, which actually ended in Manzanar. So there were people who had never gone there. They'd lived their whole life in California. They'd never gone to Manzanar with their family, which was the place where the family had actually been kept most of the time that they were there. An amazing story for them. But more amazing is the fact that some of these people are people that I've known actually for a long time. How do I actually move into their story, not move in on their story? How do I move into their story, letting a completely different family narrative actually emerge? One of these is a guy whose mom was not on the trip, but who, because of the 50th anniversary, for the first time since she was a child, was willing to actually speak about her experience of being not in Manzanar, but in another internment camp. She was about 10 years old when this happened. Within just a few hours of the law being passed, her family was moved from this really lovely home that they had lived in Santa Ana to the Santa Ana racetrack, where she and her family were in horse stalls, where they lived for the next 6 weeks. Now, I could go on with that story, which you can imagine unfolds in an extremely painful, disorienting way. But here's this amazing sense of this story that is in her life, that even her son, my friend, did not really know until this last year. Knew broad terms, not any kind of detail. Another friend, same kind of story, same sort of picture. This is a lovely, older Japanese woman who is a Presbyterian. And at a Presbyterian gathering, she, for the first time ever, spoke about her experience of being taken into one of these camps. Similar kind of story, similar kind of dramatic change of circumstances. At the event, which was videoed, there was a microphone, a standing microphone. And, you know, for people who don't use microphones very often, a microphone can feel like a very intrusive thing. And she has a very quiet demeanor, and she wasn't being heard by the audience, which you can't see on the video. So she's standing there ready to tell her story for the first time in public. And the mic is really working very well. So people are, you can hear them in the crowd shouting, "We can't hear you, we can't hear you." So then she starts saying back to them, "Can you hear me, can you hear me?" And then she says, "Are you hearing me, are you hearing me?" Now this happens throughout this whole story where she tells the unbelievable narrative of her family and the circumstances that she went through. And she keeps saying, "Are you hearing me?" Now she's literally thinking that she's meaning, "Are you literally hearing what I'm saying?" But obviously in a much more profound sense, it's like, "Are you hearing me?" Here's this person that a lot of people in that room have known for decades, who are now hearing for the first time a place of narrative that shaped her family life, her sense of what it meant to be a disciple, what it meant to be a follower of Jesus, what it meant to eventually come to release the pain and frustration of that. Now, what is flourishing? That's what we were talking about earlier this morning. What is hope in the midst of the whirlwind? It's not fixing that. It's not pretending that that moment didn't happen. It's certainly not denying that it happened. The only hope in that whirlwind is that actually we move toward such a story and such a person and allow that story and that person to deeply rewrite the narrative of our lives, right? The hope at the beginning is, can I allow her story all the way in? Or is my social location that's, you know, if it was prone to be defensive, if it was prone to be deflective, if it was prone to say she's overstating it, which would be very hard to believe. If she was prone to do this or that other thing, I'm pushing it away. No, it's actually, hope is found when, as I think Paul is describing in Ephesians 2, we become a new humanity where actually your narrative, your particular narrative becomes mine. So, a few years ago, there was an event at First Press where we were having a long series of discussions as a congregation about issues of race. And that was at a particularly important inflection moment in that long conversation. We had a gathering, and a lot of people were there, and we were sitting around tables. And because I was facilitating this, I wasn't necessarily planning to sit at a table. And then, because of how it unfolded, I decided I would sit at this table. Now, this was a table of all white people. And in this conversation, I thought, well, this is disappointing that I have to sit at this table. And then furthermore, it felt like I can't imagine that there will be anything interesting here to say. Okay. So just owning my prejudice, right? Just like going right into it. But I'm feeling all that as I sit down. So one of the questions came up, again, about the internment camps. Somebody randomly mentioned that, or so I understood. But what ended up happening was that there were two white couples at this table who were both in their 80s, couples who were both in their 80s. And they began to tell a story which neither of these couples knew about the other. And it was that at the time of the internment, they had been given the assets of a Japanese family so that they could keep the assets. And they had kept the assets of the family, in one case, ever since the internment. So that even as we sat there, this Japanese family that they had helped always then kept all of their assets in the ownership of this other family because they were so afraid that they were going to, again, have them taken, or that would remove the assets from their children or their grandchildren. In the other case, it lasted for the length of the internment. The internment came to a close and the assets were given back to the family. These families had walked so deeply in trust and love into the narrative of these other Japanese families that their life had been deeply renewed by the significance of this exercise. They never had spoken about it before. It was a quiet hope. It was an evidence of hope in the midst of the whirlwind. It was a hope that had to bear all the weight of whiteness over and against. You had to go that direction, right? There was only one way to find hope at that moment, which was to not be Japanese, that's for sure. And yet, what they found in this family and what they had reciprocated back and forth was this amazing sense of interconnection that had happened because they had taken a risk to really know and love and serve each other. These are the outposts of hope. There's programmatic, there's structural, there's systemic hope that we need to think about. But for the moment, I'm just wanting to focus on the significance of whether or not we can actually love across unexpected lines. Recently at Fuller, there has been Fuller, let me just say first of all, Fuller is a place with enormous international diversity. At any given time, 70 or 80 countries. We just had graduation a week ago. Yesterday, 42 countries were represented in the student body that graduated. It's a place of a lot of internationalism. And it's a place of reasonable amounts of ethnic and racial diversity of Americans. So both African Americans, a lot of Latinos, many different kinds of Asians, international Asians and Asian Americans. And so on one hand, you can find a lot of proximate diversity. But the question is, are we able to actually move into the deeper places of pain, especially related to African Americans, where in fact there's been a sense that African Americans at Fuller have felt recently and historically that Fuller still, etc. And it came to a flashpoint at baccalaureate. So we had understood that there was a possibility of this, and sure enough, at baccalaureate a week ago Thursday, there was a silent demonstration by African American students over what they really believed was sort of this sense that Fuller wasn't allowing them to have the space for actually full validation of their culture, their own context, their own framework, their own theological paradigm. And these were all students that I have to say I both love, I know, I care deeply about them, I know what the issues that they're talking about, and I know the difficulty of changing an established academic system. So they give this witness. And it was really powerful, and it was very painful. It was not a surprise that something was going to happen, but we didn't know what it was going to be. So after they had come forward and done this, the witness that they had come to offer, The person who was preaching was aware that this was going to happen, so invited people to stand in solidarity. And I then got up and said, the worship of Christian worship is telling the truth about God and telling the truth about our reality, about our human reality. So the truth about God we affirm through the things that we've sung and said. But the truth about our social reality is that this is a story of pain, a story of feeling that despite all of our theological rhetoric, you can still feel like you're excluded, that you're not seen, that you're not validated, that you're not understood, that you haven't internalized the deeper reset. This is not a 60s moment of trying to get more representation. This is about an incarnationalism that has to go all the way to the very core of internalizing a different social narrative. Their experience is Fuller's fundamental default setting is still a cultural, racial whiteness, not a Christian default, and not someone that's racially neutral, but actually one that cares. This is very painful. So I said it's important that in this context of worship, as surprising as all this is at this moment, we need to receive this witness. We need to take it into our life. And then I wonder if somebody here has come prepared to say something. So I waited, and one of the African-American men, the students, came forward and did a spoken word piece, which was just really powerful, very, very difficult to hear, and really, really exactly on point. Then I said, I think we need to just sit in silence and receive this. This is a really, really important thing that we're hearing. Let's not rush on to get this, I didn't say this, but to sort of get over the social awkwardness of this. Let's just instead sit in it rather than move on with it. So we did that. Then I prayed. Then we went on with some other elements of the service. Then it was time for the benediction. And I said, often at the ends of some evangelical services, there are altar calls, and I think today is the day for an altar call. But it's not an altar call for all of us. It's an altar call in particular for faculty and administrators to receive this witness and to ask ourselves, are we prepared to actually do something in light of this? Are we prepared to hear it, let it go to the core, and then reframe how we work together with each other and with the students in engaging in this set of challenges that are before us? So, and if so, then like a good altar call, I can invite you to come forward on the Sawdust Trail, but I am going to ask you to raise your hand and commit yourselves together to work with students and with each other toward a deeper hearing, a deeper acknowledgement, and a deeper response to that, which they then gave. I closed the service with benediction. That was the end of the formal service. Then there was a woman, one of our female students, African-American woman, who got a hold of a live mic. By then, the audience, this is all outside, the audience had moved to the reception area. And all of a sudden, I heard my voice being spoken over the loudspeakers. So then I moved toward it and realized that I needed to go up on the stage so that I was actually standing near her, not in any way impinging on her space, but wanting to be eye to eye. So this was actually a real conversation or a real declaration to me, not just kind of into the airspace. So I stood there, and she gave what was a really scalding word toward me, toward Fuller, toward various things that are hugely painful for her. And then that was the close of that particular part. So what I'm getting at in all that is what do we do with all that? Let that sort of be the morality play for the moment. And to ask, how do you actually not rebuff this, not in any way try to take charge of it in that sense that's sort of the white male way of doing things? How do you make sure that you're honoring these students who I actually believe truly are loving Fuller in the act of doing something that is really hard? It's easy to imagine circumstances where you could try to just push it all away. What is hope in the middle of that? Let's talk about that for a minute. What is hope in that moment? And in not just the moment, but in the... So I'd like you to turn and Paris for just a minute and say, what would be an act of hope that you think would be real hope in that kind of a circumstance? I'm going to solicit your advice. So turn to each other and brainstorm this for just a minute.
Satisfy their needs.
Okay, let's turn back together. I'm soliciting your advice. What do you think are the? First of all, let's talk about what are the real dangers in this paradigm. Let's start there. What are the dangers, do you think, in this paradigm?
I think silence
Uh-huh.
and closure. You
Right.
talked about the crust.
Right.
And I think this is a situation where the wound that's open
Right.
needs to be allowed
Yes.
into the air and the
Yes.
light.
Yes.
And it would strike me that, I mean, you know, that I would want to write a handwritten note to the young woman and
Yes.
to the young man.
Yes.
Because I think one of our deepest needs is to be known, to
Right.
be heard,
Right.
to be received as
Right.
we are, not, you know, sort of pat.
Right. Right. Okay. So remaining open, not closed,
Right.
receiving, and really internalizing the message. What else? Yes.
I think a danger for the institution relates to the constituents outside the institution, but who are nonetheless constituents, is communicating to them
Yes.
in a way that doesn't alienate them.
Yes. So let's now just remind ourselves that, of course, any given moment, except perhaps this one, let's just say, any given moment, especially in that kind of a setting, the next wave is, of course, the most uncontrollable, which is the social media, instantaneous social media reduplication of all of that in context and out of context. I'll come to that in a minute, but that's partly that wider constituents. Okay, other things. What are other dangers? Yes?
I'm curious, what is the percentage of African American students?
About 10%.
10%.
Yeah.
So one of the possibilities would be to listen and ask, how would your experience be different in the
Yes.
structure for future students?
Right, exactly. So good listening. How do you actually analyze this? What are the issues and concerns, right? Extremely important. Yes?
I think one of the challenges after a situation like this is that we're maybe some good exchanges taking place. We can all then immediately retreat back into our silos.
Yes, okay.
And so what kind of mechanism is there to further relationship?
Right.
Or to further dialogue so that I can continue to really hear about
Right.
your experience, your sphere, your space, your sociology,
Right.
that can truly impact my outlook.
Yeah. So you don't have a flashpoint that really doesn't go anywhere. You actually have to have a sustainable process in some way. Yes?
I think the faculty who raise their hands are crucial.
Yes.
And I think a raising of a hand is a private thing in a sense.
Yes.
Or could stay a private thing. I think there would need to be a way in which that hand raising was followed up as a counterpart to what you were suggesting
Yes.
from the students.
Right.
Because clearly there was an element of, okay, I'm willing to think about change. Well, okay, so what are you going to do?
Do
What are
about it.
we going to do?
Yeah.
How is this going to work in response
Right.
to the things that we hear from our students?
Right. Yes.
I think structures and systems at their best can be agile and flexible, but the gospel says when things are broken is when grace is poured out.
Yeah.
So you might resign,
Yeah.
you might create a structure of leadership. I assume in your executive staff there is a reflective diversity, but it might be
Sure.
a real integration in a genuine structural way
Right.
that would allow for a different hearing and a different forming.
Right. Absolutely. I think all those things have to be taken into consideration as real possibilities, not just hypothetical possibilities. And I love this. So what you've named, I think, are in many cases exactly the kinds of things that need to be done. And I think many of those things have been done and they were being done, they are being done now, they will keep being done. So the thing that made this particularly painful from my point of view was that there was actually an enormous amount of progress that we were making, because where we started is not where we are, and where we are is not near where we need to be. So that there's that sense of process that's already in the midstream, and the students' frustration is this feeling, not unlike what a president sometimes feels, of the difficulty of changing an institution, right? An institution, in this case, has 1,500 years of Western European, dominantly white, educational presumption built into it. And it's so presumed that it's just thought to be the way of doing business. It is the water, it is the air, it's the way that you actually just operate, when in actual fact, it may be those things, but that doesn't make it neutral, as though it's the only kind of air or the only sort of water that's available. But it is the air and water that the system has been built in. And then you have an institution with 70 years of its own particular history inside a nation with its own 400 years of racial history, and you end up with something called white evangelicalism or Protestantism, which ends up being far more embedded in sociology than it is in the gospel. And that's the crisis. So then the question, I would say the great danger is that it's not about the social moment, so it's not about the awkwardness, if you can picture the scene with parents, grandparents, and others all surrounding the graduates. So the great danger is not to disregard those people, but it is not actually about them. The greatest danger, I would say in this moment, is to not actually allow them to make the witness, and for that witness to bear fruit in a trajectory where the cost of what they've done in order to say this very difficult thing actually lands meaningfully and brings about real change. That's the greatest danger, is that it would not be allowed to have all of its fruitful bearing, even while it is also happening in the middle of pain and sadness and frustration and complexity about how you actually do this. It's not a straight road. You don't just say, okay, protest on Thursday, change by Tuesday. I mean, that's not how this goes, right? So how do you stay relentlessly grounded, clear, focused, open, engaging? So these are the things that you've named. I'm just trying to reflect back. And that is actually not just the challenge of Fuller Theological Seminary. It turns out, I would say, that's the challenge of the white American church in the middle of the whirlwind, not least right now, of racial issues in America. So where will there be hope in the midst of that whirlwind? Well, let me invite you in the way that I need to actually embrace this challenge and move into this moment of the whirlwind. I want to invite you to actually do the same in whatever context you might be in, or that you could choose to enter. That's where we have to take the risk then, to say, I'm not going to guard my own safety and social location. I'm actually prepared to move out beyond that into a world that is full of more disorientation, other messaging, risk, uncertainty, fear. All of that is something which I have to face and we have to face if there's going to be actually a church that matters in the 21st century. If we don't do this work that we're talking about right now, if we don't do this, the church in America will ultimately just dry up and look a lot more like Europe than it already does. Because if it doesn't show up as an authentic gospel in a real social reality, not least at the places of greatest difficulty, not where we're tribally segmented and happy in our own little zone, but where in fact the gospel is meant to show up in the context of reordering power for the sake of the kingdom of God, then that's going to mean a church that won't matter. And that to me is to say, I'm not being a follower of Jesus, and I'm surrendering to this encrusted gospel that is really not the gospel of Jesus Christ. So, how does that feel?
Challenging.
Challenging.
Yes, indeed.
Encouragingly uncomfortable.
Yes.
There's that phrase, reordering power for the sake of the gospel. I'd love for you to say just a little more about that.
Yeah, the reordering of power for the sake of the gospel. I guess it just struck me very early on as a reader of the New Testament that if you're making the confession, the central confession of the Christian church is simply the confession that Jesus is Lord. If that confession is being made, which is the confession on which the whole life of the church rests, then it's saying that there is no one and nothing else that's Lord, and that every other power has to be reordered in light of the fact that Jesus is Lord, which then means that my power has to be recalibrated in light of the power of Jesus, and my social power needs to be recalibrated, and my social vision needs to be recalibrated, and my understanding of what it means to have the social location of my life, but in a Philippians 2-like way, choose in imitation of Jesus to do everything possible to try to lay down that prerogative in order to be able to be a person who imitates the love of God in the world. So how do I actually do that? This again is the problem of our own social location and our assumptions. So I have lived, you have lived in contexts that have done everything possible to steep my social location. I mean, everything about my education, everything about the places I went to study, everything about the degrees and achievements of my work has been about, in a way, increasing my social location. That's the nature of the enterprise that sort of upper middle class life especially always gets the opportunity to be able to pursue. Okay, so that's one trajectory. That may or may not be necessarily bad, but it is what it is. And whatever it is, again, it's not neutral. So in light of being a follower of Jesus, what does it mean to actually do this in a way that holds these things with as much genuine, growing humility and surrender and sacrifice and offering, not in denial, putting them to work in the ways that power, which can be really constructive and positive, could and should be put to work. But how is it also a problem which has to be overcome because I have had privilege and entitlement in various ways, which has given me access to various circumstances. And that is where the reordering, so every time I come to worship, this is a theme that I have written about in a book called The Dangerous Act of Worship, Living God's Call to Justice. And in that book, what I try to say is worship is about reordering power. So every time I come, I'm going to affirm that Jesus is Lord. That means I'm not, you're not, which is a really important thing for a pastor to always remember. How do we make sure that in the songs, in the prayers, in the readings, in the exposition of the word, in the use of money, in the way that we conduct our common communal life, that we're actually practicing reordering power so that the person who may have no power or seemingly have no power or genuinely have no power is actually seen, honored, and reminded, as we need to be reminded, of their dignity and value. And that is the work of the church. But when the church is all the same sociological demographic, where it's all the same sort of easy social, racial categories that we live with every day, and then the church is not a place where we actually learn and practice these things. In fact, instead, it becomes just a set of hives of siloed people doing siloed things that never actually calls us beyond our social categories into a new humanity. So all of that and much, much more is part of the work of reordering power.
You just made the comment Jesus was Lord. What if you posed the question to the teachers, the faculty, what if Jesus was black?
Yeah, well, touche. So just recently, you may or may not know that a very, very well-known and highly influential black theologian in America died named James Cone. And his argument was that Jesus was black. He literally was black. And furthermore, that his blackness stood in the place of black culture, in the context of being people who actually live into a social location which is exactly not the social location of a great many of our faculty, for example, including myself. So yes, I mean, I think that way of perceiving things and the gauntlet that raises, throws down, is the challenge. How do we actually allow ourselves to think in those radically different terms? I was recently in the Museum of the Bible, which I would encourage you to see if you are in Washington, D.C. It's a very interesting museum with extraordinary technology and many other things. There's a lot about it to value. However, having said that, I was stunned when I walked up the staircase in the Museum of the Bible that on each of the landings, the only art piece on the landing, in each of the landings, so I think it's 5 landings, were 5 Tiffany windows of white Jesuses. So every time you went up the staircase, the first image that you saw was another Tiffany window of another white Jesus doing something, right? So he was knocking at a door, he was carrying a candle, he was shepherding a sheep. I mean, and it was just like, it's low. I mean, I spent that afternoon at the African American Museum, which again, if you have not gone, definitely go to that. So as I started thinking, how can this be? I mean, how can we, what happened, because I was there for this event for its opening, I happened to be introduced to the guy who was the director of the museum. So I said how much I liked the museum. I tried to give a good review of the museum in lots of ways, and I said, but I do have one problem. I'm wondering about this. He said, that was a mistake. They were never meant to be there. It never went through the approval process. There was somebody who gave those particular windows. This was where they wanted them to go. The museum accommodated it, and now I said, well, can they be taken out? I said, I don't really object to the thought that they should be in the museum somewhere. I suppose that's perfectly fine. It's the representation of Jesus in art, and sometimes that means white images. But really, on the landings of the only staircase in the whole place, and every single landing is a white Jesus, I said that just feels to me like it actually discredits the Bible that you've created this whole museum to actually tell about. He said, that's exactly how I feel, and I'm working on it. I don't know what's happened to those windows, and I don't know if they'll stay. My guess is they will stay. And if they do, that is just a gutting of what the museum at its best, and it's like any museum, it's never always at its best, but when at its best, it's going to redefine that. It calls that into question. But instead, the building now tells a different story. I'm not saying this to call you to not go to the museum. Actually, go and then write letters saying, take out the Tiffany windows. That would be a really good thing. So I see Mary standing because we're at the end of our time, and I simply want to say thank you for this conversation. I know that it feels really unfinished. It was not a seminar around kind of giving you a tidy list of things to do. I don't do that very well. And what I think is actually more important really is just join me in the mess and to acknowledge that we all have ways that we can step toward a reception of others' stories and a validation of those in the name of Christ with the capacity for those stories with the gospel to rewrite our own story. And I think the hope in the Whirlwind is that becomes so scalable that it's ordinary. And certainly a New Testament picture of the church is that that's actually what we're supposed to be. This isn't like a new invention of Mark Labberton in 2018. This is what Jesus and I would say Paul were trying to admonish us to be from the beginning. Thank you very much for the